Synthesizers, electronic music. I don't remember exactly the first time I became aware of its existence or heard it, but I do know the first time that it was introduced to me as something I should know about. My father taught at San Francisco State University, and he was best friends with the head of the music department. And they had lunch one day, and Alex Post, great church organist, which I used to do gigs with, actually. Alex gave my father, Howard, this album, which sort of befuddled my father. I think he played him a bit of it, and he said, I don't understand this. I'll take it home to Mark. He brought it home to me, and he said, Alex swears this is the future of music. So I figured you should know something about this. I think I was 17 or something. It was Silver Apples of the Moon, Morton Subotnick, on an early, if not the first, Buchla synthesizer. And of course, we now know that that was one of the absolute seminal works, one of the first groundbreaking explorations of electronic music on one of the quintessential instruments by one of the absolute founders of electronic music and one of the great composers of electronic music. Well, it did confuse me, I must be honest. It confused me at the beginning, but I was drawn to it and knew that, yes, in fact, I could believe that this was the future of music. And I studied that album over the years. I even wanted to do a recreation of it at one point, cover it, if you will. And I spoke to Morton about it and asked if he had any documents from it. He said, well, it was transcribed for orchestra. You could buy the score. And I sort of must admit my passion for that project sort of fell away at that point. Because it's chance, you know, that music has this sort of just, you set things up and things happen that you can't predict. And I think that is why electronic music is such a fascination for me, because it, like jazz, you set things up and things happen that you can't predict. And I just love that about the creative act. So I was aware that there was this group of people headed by Mr. Buchla over at Mills College, and they were making things. And then I, of course, became aware that there was a Robert Moog on the East Coast, Rochester, I believe, somewhere mid-upper New York State, was making things. But my first real passion for an instrument itself came out of the jazz world through Joe Zawinul. Now, Joe, if I had to pick one musician that was probably the biggest influence overall in my entire career, I think it would have to be Joe, over Miles, over John Adams, over a lot of other people who have had a huge impact upon me. But Joe, in general, hit everything that I love about music. He had that Western classical background. So there was always that in the back of everything he did, which is very similar to me. He had a profound love of Black music and the evolution of American jazz and American Black music, and was educated himself phenomenally well in it. And he loved gear, electronic stuff, and the sounds and the infinite possibilities electronic music give you. And so I noticed on, I think it was the second Weather Report album, that he was really diving into the synthesizer, and I had to know what that was. And of course, it turned out to be the ARP 2600. I couldn't afford one. I was working in a music store at the time, Whitney's Band Instruments on Mission Street in San Francisco. And Lou Whitney was a very generous guy. He loved music and wanted to bring music to everyone he could. And I was his stock boy and cleaned all the band instruments for summer band rentals. One day I looked in the store window, and there was this keyboard there with buttons and knobs above it. And I looked closely, and it was an ARP Odyssey, which I think is the 2300, I believe so. And I went, oh my God, it's not a 2600, but boy, it's the little brother. And so I said to Lou, I said, where did you get that? He said, you know, they sent it to me. They said, put it in the window. Maybe you can sell it. And so I ruminated on that for a long time. And I finally went to Lou and I said, look, I actually do know what it is. I actually really want one. Would you sell it to me? And can I just pay you on time? And he said yes. And so there was, I think I just had him take it right out of my check every week. and eventually paid it off. My first ARP Odyssey. I don't have it anymore because about 2 years later, I traded up. I sold it. I sold it to a wonderful San Francisco keyboard player, Paul Potian, and I bought my first 2600. So, but that Odyssey was a wonderful instrument, and it really taught me hands-on a tremendous amount about electronic music and synthesis. The ARP 2600 manual, in fact, the first half of that book is still the best tutorial on electronic music I've ever read. So that, with my Odyssey, was how I learned about electronic music and synthesis. So ARP was a fantastic company. I always thought they were sort of went up against the Moog, who was established the position of dominance. They were the ones, and of course Robert Moog was he and Don Buchla invented the bloody things. I mean, but Alan Perlman, ARP, Alan R. Perlman, had these great design ideas, and the 2500, I believe, which I still covet. I would buy one if I could ever find one. Had a tremendous new patching technique, so you didn't need all these patch cables, or you needed much less of them. And then, so when he came and designed the 2600, it was patched internally, but you could interrupt the patches with patch cables. Unlike the Moog, which nothing is patched internally, everything has to be connected by the user. So the 2600 was revolutionary in that sense, in that it first defined that a modular synthesizer could be non-modular in design, but still have all the advantages of having separate modules. Now in the San Francisco area at that time, there were very, very few role models. I sort of felt alone. But soon I discovered Patrick Gleason. I had started Different Fur, and he of course was Emulator, EMU. That was his flagship work in those days. Bernie Krause was around. And then fortunately, I discovered up the street from me lived Warner Jepson. And Warner, I think, was part of that Mills College group with Buchla. And he had a Buchla 100 series in his living room. And I would this was my first one, I would take my 2600 up the street and we'd sit in Warner's living room. And I'd plug in and we'd do little jam sessions with a 2600 and a Buchla 100 series. So early recordings with some of these instruments, I think the only recording I did with the Odyssey was a record I did with the Sons of Champlin when I was still in that band. And I used to play that with them occasionally, and did a track on one of the records featuring the Odyssey. But then once the 2600 came, I became a little more confident in doing sessions and things like that, and did sessions for a few people here and there. And I started performing live with it. With Rubisa Patrol, the jazz group I had with Art Landy. It was a very adventuresome, modern jazz improvisational group. So the 2600 was perfect for that. And then, of course, the 2600 stayed with me for many, many years. And I actually toured with it for the first round of Group 87 records. I was driven by one of the first Dave Smith sequencers ever made, and that we'll talk about at a later time. And that was sort of my little 2600 rack for a while. It was Dave's sequencer, the 2600, and I think the MXR delay. And that was a pretty hip little setup for back then. Very, very cool. Could do a lot of really, really cool stuff. So I mentioned Joe Zawinul, of course. So a lot of my keyboard arsenal in those days that I was building around, mostly for Group 87. I was never a professional keyboard player for other people. That's not true. I did do 2 tours for others, which we'll talk about maybe later. But I was Group 87's keyboard player, and I built a rig very, very close to Zawinul's because Joe, again, still at this point, he was still my big influence. And Group 87 was a very, just a fusion band. Like a pop fusion band. So the music wasn't random, didn't have a lot of the stuff that one would use other types of synthesis for. So I again, saved and scraped up money and eventually bought a 4-voice. I think I bought them several expander modules at a time, believe it or not. I ran a 2600 with 2 expander modules for a while, and eventually got the 4-voice and kept the 2600, and then got a Prophet, which of course was Alman's setup for a long, long time. And I basically just copied him because I still felt that his sound and his use of keyboards at that point was just still the best. I loved it so much, and I wanted to learn how he did that, and therefore I got the instruments that he was using to do that. So as Group 87 evolved, the 2600 stopped going on the road because it didn't have memory, and the Prophet, of course, has memory. The Oberheim 4-voice has memory, and eventually I have some more modern keyboards all with memory, and it was, as a live instrument, much more feasible. But I did do vapor drawings with the 2600, and it played a huge role in that record. A lot of all the wonderful glistening sequences, that's all the 2600. A lot of the bass is out of the 2600. It's such a musical voice and musical sound, and still, if I had to pick one synthesizer that I know the best and feel that I could be quickly expressive with, it's probably the 2600. So on the timeline here, I had gone to England. My paying gig was with Van Morrison, and I was playing some keyboard, which at that time was the Prophet 5, and trumpet and piccolo trumpet with Van, and so that's where I made vapor drawings, in a studio in London. And all my gear was shipped over. The 2600, the 4-voice, was all there. And I was very fortunate. I worked at Chaz Jankel's studio. Now, Chaz isn't a name that a lot of American people know, and maybe not even English people anymore. But he had some huge hits back in the 80s. And fortunately, I was best friends with his childhood best friend. Peter Van Hook introduced us, and I ended up working a lot with Chaz on several of his records, and then used Chaz's studio to make vapor drawings, Eastcote Studios. So the other project at that time that I used the 2600 on was, of course, the second Group 87 record, because that also was made in England in a country studio in Dorking. And I realized had met all these rich English rock star guys who had semi-retired and bought estates in the countryside and built studios, in the barn, and I would go and do sessions for them. A lot of them on the 2600, and I realized that was sort of a dream I wanted. Eventually, I wanted to have a place where I could have a barn with a studio in it, like these guys did, and actually. Many years later, I did realize that dream. So after finishing those two records in London, I got called back to the States. Might have been by the immigration department. I'm not sure. Maybe. So I returned, brought all the gear back, and that was quite an adventure to walk through immigration with tons of gear. That's another story, which perhaps I'll have to have a couple of cocktails to tell that story. Anyway, and I dove into film composition. I had done my first and started to get offered several more. And the 2600 was a big part of this. The Times of Harvey Milk, the Academy Award-winning documentary. The Hitcher, that was a big one. And starting right around the Hitcher, the electronic music, it's really started to become very popular, and all sorts of interesting instruments were being invented. I think the first sampled drum machines were out by then, and one-shot samplers, so the whole vocabulary of film scoring for me started to expand at that point. During this point, the evolution of electronic music technology is just taking off. It's skyrocketing. It's just every week there's a new piece of gear. It's getting smaller, it's getting cheaper, it's getting cooler, it's getting hipper. I don't know if it's getting hipper, but a lot of hip things. But these guys still, it's hard to beat what they can do. And I think the last score where I actually went to the back wall and bothered to patch it all together and use the real thing was Point Break. a lot of those great arpeggios and flying stuff over the skydiving and everything. That is the 2600, the real 2600. And then of course it becomes plugins after that, and it's not as much fun, but I got to say it's a lot more practical when you're actually scoring films. So the 2600 in the modern world, well, they're still here. They're plugged up. This one's completely restored by Phil Sirocco. And speaking of Phil Sirocco, he is the gentleman that is probably one of the premier restorers of ARP instruments. I think he's done Pete Townshend's 2500. He's done my 2600. He's got Hans Zimmer's stuff. And he also built and designed his own synthesizer modeled after the ARP, in fact. And I had him make me one specifically modeled after the ARP 2500, which is here, the CMS. And I'm using that quite a bit these days, along with these guys on special electronic music projects that I'm working on, one of which actually will be out very soon. In fact, might be out by the time this video is viewed. I have a track on an ambient compilation coming out, and I'm working on several other electronic music projects that do use these real instruments. So they're 2600 and the ARP synthesizer is very, very much alive and well and kicking in my world. ARP and the ARP 2600 were really the starting point for me of synthesis, and it's my Martin trumpet. It pulled me in and kept me going and inspired me for many, many years. And the whole sound of ARP with Phil's CMS and the restored ARPs, they're very much a part of my world and very much alive and kicking over here.